The morning was quiet in the small town, with cars passing slowly on the road and the sound of tools clinking in the mechanic's workshop. The mechanic was busy with an old car that needed a lot of work. His hands were covered in grease, and sweat ran down his forehead, but he worked carefully, making sure every part was fixed properly. He lived a simple life, one where money never seemed enough, but he was proud of the way he helped people in the community. He never thought too much about himself. Instead, he found comfort in knowing his work made someone else's day easier. That morning, as he bent down to tighten a bolt, he noticed a small boy on the sidewalk across the street. The boy looked frustrated, struggling to push his wheelchair, which was stuck at an odd angle. The wheels seemed to have come loose, and no matter how hard he tried, the boy couldn't move it forward. His mother was right beside him, holding onto the handles and trying to help, but her face showed deep worry. People walked past them, glancing quickly but not stopping. It was one of those moments when everyone could see what was wrong, yet no one wanted to step out of their way. The mechanic put his tools down and wiped his hands on a cloth. Something inside told him he couldn't ignore the sight. Without thinking twice, he walked out of the workshop and crossed the street. The boy looked up, his eyes wide and nervous, unsure what the man was about to say. The mother gave a small, polite smile, almost embarrassed, as if she didn't want to trouble anyone. But the mechanic crouched down to the boy's level and asked in a gentle voice, "Mind if I take a look at that wheel?" The boy hesitated for a moment, then nodded. The mechanic carefully examined the wheelchair, noticing the bolts were loose and one of the small bearings had worn out. It wasn't a big job for someone who fixed engines and tires every day, but to the boy, it was everything. The mechanic pulled a small kit from his pocket. He always carried a few extra tools with him. He worked quickly, tightening the screws, adjusting the wheel, and cleaning the dirt that had built up inside. The boy watched closely, his expression shifting from worry to curiosity. The mother stood silently, relief slowly replacing the fear in her eyes. As the mechanic worked, he spoke lightly to keep the boy calm. He asked if the wheelchair often gave him trouble, and if he liked going outside. The boy answered in short sentences at first, but soon his face brightened, and he began sharing small details about his day, how he loved racing down the street when the wheels worked properly, and how he didn't like being stuck indoors. The mechanic listened patiently, nodding and smiling, making sure the boy knew he was being heard. Within minutes, the job was done. The mechanic gave the wheel one last spin, making sure it rolled smoothly. Then he stepped back and said, "Try it now." The boy placed his hands on the wheels and gave them a push. To his surprise, the wheelchair glided forward without any trouble. He laughed out loud, a sound filled with pure joy. His mother's eyes watered as she whispered thank you, not once but several times. She offered to pay, but the mechanic shook his head and smiled warmly. "No need," he said. "I'm just glad he can move around again." The boy wheeled himself in circles, testing every direction. His face lit up brighter with each turn. People nearby stopped to watch, some smiling, some whispering, surprised at how a stranger had stepped in when no one else had. The mother placed her hand on the mechanic's arm and said softly, "You have no idea what this means to us." But he shrugged it off, brushing his hands against his work clothes. To him, it was nothing more than a simple repair, something that took a few minutes out of his day. Yet as he walked back to his workshop, he couldn't shake the picture of the boy's laughter. It echoed in his mind like music. He returned to his car repair, but his heart felt lighter than before. He didn't know that this one small act of kindness was about to change the course of his life in ways he never imagined. For now, all he saw was a boy happily rolling away with his mother, both smiling, both grateful, while he stood quietly in the doorway of his workshop, feeling a deep sense of peace. The evening after fixing the boy's wheelchair, the mechanic closed up his workshop later than usual. His back ached from bending over cars all day, and the grease on his hands was so deep it wouldn't wash off easily. Still, he felt a quiet warmth inside him that he couldn't explain. The sound of that boy's laughter earlier kept coming back to him, like a song that played again and again. For a man who lived a life filled with clattering tools and the smell of oil, that moment of joy had left a mark deeper than he thought possible. His workshop was modest, with a rusty tin roof that leaked whenever it rained and walls that were patched more times than he could count. The cars that came in were often as old as the building itself, but the people trusted him because he never cheated them. He would often fix small things for free, like tightening a belt, changing a bulb, or adjusting brakes. Sometimes he would even accept fresh bread, fruits, or a simple thank you instead of money. Life wasn't easy, and bills piled up on his desk every month, but he always believed kindness mattered more than anything. That night, as he ate his dinner of bread and lentils, he thought about the boy's mother. She had tried so hard to offer him money for the wheelchair repair, her hands trembling as she pulled a few notes from her bag. The mechanic knew it wasn't much, and it broke his heart to see the struggle in her eyes. He refused politely, telling her that the boy's smile was payment enough. He didn't say it for praise or to sound noble. He meant it from the depths of his soul. He knew what it was like to have little. He knew what it meant when someone showed kindness without asking for anything in return. The days that followed went by quickly. Customers came and left, cars broke down and were fixed again, and the routine of life continued. Yet every night, the mechanic found himself remembering the boy. He wondered if the wheelchair was still rolling smoothly, if the boy had raced down the street like he said he loved to do. He didn't realize that his simple gesture had already traveled far beyond what he imagined. The boy's mother had shared the story with her relatives, telling them how a humble mechanic dropped his own work just to help her son. Her voice carried emotion as she explained how he didn't ask for a single coin in return, how he only cared about making the boy happy. She didn't know that one of her relatives was a man of great influence, someone with resources that stretched beyond what ordinary people could dream of. When he heard the story, he was struck silent. He had spent his life surrounded by wealth, luxury, and deals worth millions. Yet here was a man with nothing extra in his pocket, offering kindness so pure it could not be measured. The influential man began to think about what it meant. In his world, people often gave expecting something in return. But this mechanic had given without knowing who the boy was, without expecting any reward. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that such kindness deserved to be honored. Quietly, he made plans with the boy's mother. They would not tell the mechanic yet. They wanted it to be a surprise, something that would touch his heart the way he had touched theirs. Meanwhile, the mechanic continued his simple life. He fixed engines, replaced worn tires, and sometimes sat alone outside his workshop at night, staring at the stars. He had dreams once, big ones, of traveling to places far away, seeing skies different from his own, and maybe flying on a plane. But life had been hard, and those dreams had turned into quiet wishes he buried deep inside. He never spoke about them to anyone, not even to himself. Little did he know, while he sat under the open sky, his kindness had already set something in motion. Something far bigger than his imagination. Somewhere in the distance, plans were being made, plans that involved the roar of engines far louder than any car he had ever repaired. Plans that would soon land at his doorstep and turn his quiet, modest life upside down. Days turned into weeks, and life at the small workshop stayed the same for the mechanic. Every morning, he opened the heavy metal shutters, swept away the dust that settled overnight, and began working on whatever car or motorbike was waiting outside. Customers trusted him, not because his shop looked fancy, but because they knew his hands were steady and his heart was honest. He often earned just enough to keep his life going, but he carried himself with quiet dignity, never once showing how difficult things sometimes got. What he didn't know was that far away, in a world very different from his own, conversations about him were taking place. The boy's family had not forgotten what he did that day. The mother retold the story to relatives, not once, but several times, each time with tears in her eyes as she described how the mechanic bent down on the hot pavement and fixed the wheelchair as if it were the most important job in the world. Her son, whenever asked, spoke proudly about the kind man who made his wheels work again. Every mention of the story carried a warmth that couldn't be ignored. One relative in particular, an influential businessman with a powerful presence, listened carefully. He was a man used to deals, wealth, and constant movement across countries. He had private jets waiting at his command, offices in tall glass buildings, and people rushing to please him. Yet, when he heard the story of the mechanic, it silenced him. He couldn't help but compare. In his world, kindness was often a performance, something shown only when cameras were on or contracts were signed. But here was a man who, with nothing to spare, gave the best of himself to a child he didn't know. No cameras, no expectations, just pure humanity. The businessman felt something stir inside him. He decided that such a heart should not go unnoticed. The mechanic deserved more than a quiet thank you. He deserved to see that his kindness had the power to move lives beyond his own street. The businessman began speaking with the boy's mother. They made plans slowly and carefully. They didn't want to rush it. They wanted the surprise to feel like a miracle. Meanwhile, the mechanic lived unaware of all this. His struggles continued. Some days he barely had enough customers. At night, he sometimes sat on a worn wooden chair outside his workshop, looking at the sky as planes crossed high above. He wondered what it felt like to sit inside one, to see the world from above the clouds. He never spoke these thoughts aloud. They felt too far away from the life he lived. For him, dreams were best kept tucked away in silence. One afternoon, as he worked on a broken-down taxi, a few men in neat suits passed by and looked at his shop. He noticed them but paid no attention. People often glanced at him, some with respect, others with pity, and a few with quiet judgment about how poor his place looked compared to modern garages. He stayed focused on his work. He didn't realize these quiet observers were connected to the plans being made for him. The boy and his mother also visited the businessman again. This time, the boy wheeled himself around proudly, his chair rolling smoothly thanks to the mechanic's repair. He laughed as he showed how easily it moved. The businessman watched him and felt his chest tighten. He thought, this man gave this child freedom again, and he never asked for anything back. How many people like that are left in this world? The decision became final in his mind. He would repay this kindness in a way the mechanic could never imagine. As the days moved forward, arrangements began quietly behind the scenes. Phone calls were made, permissions were granted, and a sleek private jet was prepared. The family wanted everything perfect. They didn't want to simply hand him money. They wanted him to experience something that would make him believe in miracles, the same way his kindness had created one for them. Back in the workshop, the mechanic still worked late into the night. His tools clinked in rhythm, and his shirt carried the stains of oil that no amount of washing could remove. He sighed as he placed a stack of unpaid bills aside, choosing to eat less rather than leave a customer's car unfinished. He didn't know that soon, all of this, the worry, the struggles, the quiet night staring at the stars, was about to change. Something was moving toward him, something bigger than he ever thought possible. The morning began like any other for the mechanic. The sun rose slowly, painting the sky in soft orange light, and the street outside his workshop carried the usual rhythm of footsteps, bicycles, and the occasional honk of passing cars. He lifted the shutters of his small garage and prepared for another long day. A rusty motorbike waited for repair, and an old van sat near the entrance, coughing smoke each time its owner tried to start it. To him, it was just another day, another set of problems to fix with his hands. But something unusual was in the air. He noticed people on the street glancing upward, pointing toward the sky. The sound of engines roared above, not the kind from cars or motorbikes, but something far louder, deeper, and more powerful. When he looked up, he saw a private jet slicing across the clouds, before slowly descending toward the small airstrip on the edge of town. It wasn't a common sight. In fact, most people there had never seen a jet land so close before. The mechanic paused, holding a wrench in his hand, and shook his head, thinking, "That's for important people, not for folks like us." He went back to work, but the noise of excitement outside kept pulling his attention. People gathered in small groups, whispering and speculating. Some even rushed toward the road that led to the airstrip, hoping to catch a closer look. The mechanic stayed put, certain it had nothing to do with him. An hour later, while he was bent over the van's engine, he heard the sound of a car stopping outside his shop. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and straightened his back. To his surprise, it wasn't an ordinary car. A sleek black luxury vehicle stood at the curb, its paint gleaming in the sunlight. The doors opened smoothly, and out stepped the boy, the same one whose wheelchair he had repaired weeks earlier. His mother followed, her face glowing with warmth. And then, from the other side, came a tall man in a fine suit, the businessman relative whose life moved in circles the mechanic had never even imagined. For a moment, the mechanic froze. He wasn't used to visitors like these. He felt the grease on his hands, the dirt on his clothes, and the mess of his small shop, and a wave of embarrassment swept over him. But before he could say a word, the boy wheeled himself forward with a wide smile. "Look," the boy said excitedly, spinning his chair in a perfect circle. "It still works perfectly." His laughter filled the workshop, just like it had that day on the street. The mother walked closer, her voice trembling with emotion. "We told you that day that you had no idea what your kindness meant to us," she said. "Today we've come to show you." The mechanic tilted his head in confusion, unsure what she meant. The businessman stepped forward, his presence commanding yet kind. He looked the mechanic in the eyes and spoke firmly. "Your act of kindness touched us deeply. You didn't know who this boy was, and you didn't ask for a thing. You gave from your heart. And when people like you show the world that kind of goodness, it deserves to be honored." The mechanic shook his head quickly, his voice low and humble. "I didn't do anything special," he said. "I only fixed a wheel. That's all." The businessman smiled faintly. "To you, it may have been a wheel. To this boy, it was freedom. And to us, it was a reminder that kindness still exists in its purest form." Before the mechanic could respond, the businessman gestured toward the road. Another sleek car pulled up, and several assistants stepped out. One of them handed the businessman a small envelope. He opened it and showed the mechanic what was inside, an invitation, written with elegance and care. It was a personal request for him to come to the airstrip where the jet still waited. The mechanic's heart raced. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly. He had dreamed of planes, but never thought he would be anywhere near one, let alone be invited aboard. "Why me?" he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. The mother answered gently. "Because you gave when you didn't have to. Because you reminded us of something the world often forgets, that kindness can be more powerful than wealth." The boy clapped his hands with excitement. "Come with us. You'll see." The mechanic glanced around at his small workshop, at the old cars and scattered tools. This was his world, one of grease, hard work, and modest living. And now, a door was opening to something completely different, something he never imagined possible. He swallowed hard, wiped his hands nervously on his apron, and nodded slowly as he stepped outside. The sight waiting for him made his knees weak. The convoy of luxury cars lined up on the street, their polished surfaces reflecting the afternoon sun. Curious neighbors gathered, watching in awe as the humble mechanic, the man they saw every day fixing worn-out cars, was being escorted by people who lived in a world far above theirs. The boy wheeled beside him, grinning from ear to ear. "You're going to love this," he said. And the mechanic, though still unsure, felt something stirring in his chest, an unfamiliar mix of fear, hope, and wonder. He didn't know exactly what was coming, but one thing was certain: his life was no longer the same. The mechanic's footsteps felt heavy as he walked toward the waiting convoy, his heart beating faster with each step. The boy wheeled himself beside him, smiling with excitement as if he knew a secret the mechanic had yet to discover. The mother walked quietly, her hand resting gently on her son's shoulder, while the businessman led the way with a calm but purposeful stride. Curious neighbors trailed behind at a distance, whispering, trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. The mechanic, who was known only as the man who fixed cars and motorbikes, was being escorted like an honored guest. When they reached the airstrip, the sight before him made the mechanic stop in his tracks. The private jet stood tall and gleaming, its white body shining under the afternoon sun, with its steps lowered as if waiting for him. The roar of its engines had stopped, leaving behind a silence that seemed to hold its breath. The mechanic rubbed his eyes for a moment, half convinced he was dreaming. He had fixed countless vehicles in his life, but never in his wildest imagination had he thought he would stand this close to something that belonged in another world. The businessman turned to him with a kind smile. "This is for you," he said softly. The mechanic frowned in confusion. "For me? No. There must be some mistake. I'm just a simple man. I don't belong here." His voice shook, not from fear, but from disbelief. The boy spoke up quickly. "You helped me when no one else did. You fixed my chair. You gave me back my freedom. Now it's your turn to see what your kindness has done." The businessman placed a hand on the mechanic's shoulder and said firmly, "You reminded us that goodness still lives in the world. We wanted to repay you in a way you will never forget. Today, this jet is not for us, it's for you." Tears stung the mechanic's eyes, but he quickly looked away, trying to hide his emotions. He had spent his whole life struggling, patching holes in his roof, skipping meals so he could pay for tools, working long nights to make ends meet. And now here he was, being offered something so far beyond his reach that it almost felt unreal. Slowly, hesitantly, he climbed the steps of the jet. His hands gripped the railing tightly, his heart racing faster with every move upward. When he entered, his breath caught. The inside was nothing like he had ever seen before. Plush leather seats stretched out on both sides, soft carpets covered the floor, and golden light filled the cabin. The air smelled of luxury and comfort, a world away from oil, grease, and dust. He stood frozen, afraid to even sit down, afraid that touching anything might ruin it. The boy wheeled in behind him, laughing happily. "Sit down. This is all for you today." The mechanic finally lowered himself onto one of the seats, and for the first time, he felt what it was like to sink into comfort that embraced him completely. The businessman explained gently, "We don't want to just thank you with words. We want to give you something that can change your life. This jet will fly you wherever you wish today. And beyond that, we will support your workshop. New tools, better equipment, anything you need to grow your work, we will provide it." The mechanic shook his head, his voice trembling. "I never asked for this. I don't deserve this." The mother leaned forward and said softly, "That's what makes you deserving. You gave when you had little. You helped without expecting. That kind of heart deserves more than thanks." The engines hummed back to life, and the mechanic felt the jet begin to move. As it rolled down the runway, his palms grew sweaty, and his chest tightened. Then, suddenly, the force of takeoff pushed him back into his seat, and the ground slipped away beneath him. He looked out the window and saw his town growing smaller, the streets, the houses, and even his workshop turning into tiny dots. The clouds drew closer until they surrounded him completely. For the first time in his life, he was flying. Tears rolled down his cheeks, but he didn't hide them this time. He laughed and cried all at once, the emotions too big to contain. The boy clapped his hands with joy, and his mother smiled through her own tears. The businessman sat quietly, watching the scene with satisfaction, knowing he had done something meaningful. Hours later, when the jet landed back, the mechanic stepped out with shaky legs, his heart still full. The boy's family reminded him once again that they would support his workshop and his future. He could hardly find words. All he managed to say, again and again, was thank you. That night, when he returned to his small home, he sat outside under the same sky he had always watched. But this time, everything felt different. He had touched the clouds. He had seen the world from above. And he knew it wasn't just the flight that had changed him. It was the reminder that kindness, no matter how small, always finds a way to return, often in ways beyond imagination. From that day forward, people didn't just see him as the local mechanic. They saw him as a man whose simple act of compassion had reached the sky. And in his heart, he carried the truth that would stay with him forever. When you give without expecting, the universe has its own way of giving back.